Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name's Elisa Douglas, Director of Alumni Engagement and Programs at Columbia Business School. Welcome to our CBS Faculty Live virtual talk. This virtual series brings our CBS thought leaders to you no matter where you're located. In just a moment, we will hear from our speaker, Professor Bruce Usher, on his talk, AI Growth, Power Demand, and the Implications for Climate Change. For quick housekeeping, we'll have Professor Usher present, and then we'll open up for Q&A. During the Q&A portion, we ask that you please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. Now, a little background on our speaker. Bruce Usher is a professor of professional practice in the Elizabeth B. Strickler and Mark Galloway Faculty Director of the Tamer Institute for Social Enterprise and Climate Change at Columbia Business School. He is also professor of professional practice in the Faculty of Climate at the Columbia Climate School. He teaches courses on climate change, finance, and business, and is a recipient of multiple teaching awards. Prior to his work at Columbia, Professor Usher was CEO of Eco Securities Group, which developed greenhouse gas emission reduction projects in developing countries and was acquired by JP Morgan in 2009. Professor Usher is an active investor and advisor to entrepreneurial ventures focused on climate change and clean energy. He is also the chair of the Tamer Fund for Social Ventures. He earned his MBA from Harvard Business School. Now, with great pleasure, I'd like to hand it over to Professor Bruce Usher.
Thank you, Lisa, for that long but kind introduction. Welcome, everyone, from Columbia Business School, from my office in Kravis Hall, Columbia Business School. If you haven't been to the new campus the last 3 years, if you haven't visited us, I encourage you to do so, no matter where you are in the world. I'm going to just speak for about 25 or 30 minutes, reasonably short presentation for you on this topic, and then open it up to questions, because I have to take any questions you may have on climate change and business, or this presentation specifically. Let me jump right into it and start off with a question here. The most important chart in 100 years. There'd be plenty of debate as to what is the most important chart in 100 years. And some people would say it's simply this one, the number of days it's taken for users to adopt a new technology. This slide shows how many users it takes to get first 1 million users and then 100 million users. By technology, you'll see technologies like Netflix took about 10 years. Technologies like Twitter took about 6-7 years. Instagram only took about 2 years. ChatGPT took only a matter of weeks. About 100 days maybe altogether, to get 100 million users. No technology in the history of humanity has ever been adopted so quickly, which has all sorts of implications for society, for employment, for business, for the equity markets, and so on. We're going to focus on just one implication of the adoption, the rapid adoption of AI, and that is that AI requires power, enormous amounts of power. And when I use the word power, I mean electricity. And it requires power for two reasons, one of which is obvious, which is when you use AI, whether it's ChatGPT or any other large language models that are out there, when you use it, it's going to a data center and doing a series of calculations. And that AI is, of course, using power to do it, about 10 times as much power as it would for a typical Google search. Depends what you use the AI for. If you're creating cat videos, it's going to use a great deal of power. If you're just doing a simple query, you would use much less. But, and here's a key thing to understand, most of the power needs of AI today are not in users using large language models. Most of the power demand is in developing those models, what's called the training of the models. You'll see this chart. This chart shows you that over time, over the last 15 years, as these models have been developed, the amount of computation needed has been going up at a logarithmic pace, because the y-axis here is logarithmic. And There's some argument as to whether it will continue to grow at a logarithmic pace. More computation means more power needed. This is how we can approximate power needs. There's no way to know with certainty. Um, these models run to train a large language model takes about 6 months of running a very, very large data center network to develop the models. And so as long as we keep advancing these models, the power needs to train them will be very, very large in addition to the use. And so, of course, this power need is all in data centers, and US data center load growth is forecast to grow dramatically across the country, although primarily in the northeast of the country, what's called the PJM is the part of the country where we have the largest concentration of data centers today, particularly around Virginia in that area. But you'll see data center growth throughout the country, and with that, demand for more electricity power. And so if we sort of think about that at a global scale, what we're looking at is data center power needs are going to increase by 2030, estimated to become as large as the electricity demand for all but three countries in the world today. The only, if we start to look at measure this as a nationality, data centers are just behind India in total electricity use globally. So when it comes to power and electricity demand, data centers driven primarily by the growth in AI are going to be tremendous drivers of power in the future, which raises an important question, which is what are the solutions that AI demand for power? And as you probably know, there are many ways of generating electricity, and they all generate the same thing, which is electrons. So in a sense, we have many solutions to this one single problem, and that's good news. But each of these solutions, as I'll dig into, have different attributes, different advantages and disadvantages, and ultimately, from a climate change perspective, different advantages, disadvantages. I want to describe 7 of those solutions. I'll go through this really quickly. There are some others, for example, hydro or coal, but I exclude those either because they're just not good solutions or they're very expensive solutions. They have other reasons they're unlikely to be a solution, particularly here in the US. In the US, these 7 potential solutions are the ones that are going to meet the AI demand for power. So let's just dig into them and understand what these solutions are, and ultimately get to the point of which one of these solutions is going to win. Which one of these is going to solve the AI demand for power, which is important for AI, important for investors in these technologies, and ultimately important for climate change. So the first solutions, the first 2 there are renewable, wind and solar. And you may be surprised to know that today they're the default solution. So today, wind, solar, and battery storage, which is really a way of making wind and solar available 24 hours a day, they account for more than 90% of all new US additions this year. So all new investment, all new build in electricity generation in the US at the moment is pretty much wind, solar, and storage. And the reason for that is really quite simple. These are the cheapest forms of power generation in the country today. You see the quote on the right side of your screen. Utility scale solar and onshore wind, excuse me, are the most cost-effective forms of new build energy generation. And that's on an unsubsidized basis. So even though the OBBB Act, President Trump's signature legislation from earlier this year, even though it removed many of the subsidies for renewable energy, in fact, wind and solar still are the default for new power in the country today. But they're not our only solution. As we saw, there's actually 7 of them. Those are just the first 2. The next solution is nuclear. And nuclear, you probably read about a lot these days, getting a lot of press coverage. When people say nuclear, they really mean one of 2 forms of nuclear. The first is SMR. SMR are small modular reactors. SMR nuclear is in some ways an old technology that's being developed in a modern way, doing factory build of nuclear. These are relatively small, up to 300 megawatts. However, they're not yet commercialized. So they have a forecast cost or LCOE of about $50 to $60 a megawatt hour. And the first projects likely be operational at 2030. Nuclear SMR uses traditional fission technology. That's the splitting of the atom, as we have in all nuclear plants today worldwide. SMR is just a more efficient way of generating power through nuclear fission. Nuclear fusion, on the other hand, is the splitting of the atom. It has the potential to generate 3 times as much power as fission. It's sort of the ultimate source of power. But today, there are several technological hurdles to nuclear fusion. It's unclear whether it'll ever be commercial. And the best guesses are that it may be operational in mid to late 2030s. So the nuclear options are there. But in both cases, we won't actually have any operational solutions for 5 years or more. The next area that's not that well known, although it's gotten a lot of press just in the last couple of weeks, actually, is what's called enhanced geothermal. So geothermal is when you dig into the surface of the earth. Conventional geothermal is on the right of the screen, where you drill into the earth to tap a reservoir of hot water or steam, and that water or steam is brought to the surface and used to drive a turbine and generate electricity. Geothermal is a very conventional way of generating electricity. It's been around for many, many decades. The problem is there's not that many places in the world that have available reservoirs of hot water or steam. It's relatively rare, actually. Enhanced geothermal is an entirely new way of capturing heat. You don't need a reservoir. You simply drill into rock. You have to drill very deep into hot rock. And that technology was not available until fairly recently with the advancements of drilling and fracking technologies from the oil and gas industry. So this utilizes established technologies. It has tremendous potential throughout the US and globally, in fact. It generates 24-hour a day, 7-day a week firm power with no CO2 emissions. And it's starting to become commercialized now. The first operational project will be up and running in 2026. It's already partially operational. It has a forecast price point that's quite attractive, $45 a megawatt hour. By 2035, the first projects are quite expensive, and nobody quite knows how fast the costs come down, or whether this will be price competitive in the future. But this is an interesting technology that's being rapidly developed here in the US. The next solution is a very traditional one, natural gas, specifically natural gas using combined cycle power plants. This is the largest form of power generation in the US today in terms of established power plants, sort of the backbone of electricity generation in the country. And so one would expect that data center power demand would be met with natural gas combined cycle plants in the future. The problem with this technology is that it requires very sophisticated turbines, and there is a very large backorder of gas turbines globally. In fact, there are really only 3 manufacturers: Siemens, GE, Mitsubishi Power. All 3 of them have very large order books that have backlogged many years, but 3 to 7 years. And so this is slowing down the build of new natural gas combined cycle plants, despite the fact that they're already well-established technology. Another use of natural gas is through fuel cells. So a fuel cell is a completely different way of using natural gas. It doesn't burn the gas. It puts it through a chemical process, which converts the gas into energy and oxygen or water as an output. And the attractive thing about fuel cells is that they're available today. There's no real backlog in them today, and they're very distributable. You can see from the picture on the right that fuel cells can be placed pretty much anywhere, including right next to a data center. Because of this, the leading provider of fuel cells, a company called Bloom Energy, based in California, it's done very well in the stock market. Stock is up 1,000% this year because they are selling a lot of their units to data centers to power AI. The problem with fuel cells is they're costly. It's an expensive way of generating power, as you see down at the bottom of the screen. They cost about 11 cents a kilowatt hour, which is about 3 times the cost of generating electricity from solar, wind, or even natural gas. So that's an option here for solving our power problem. And there's one last option that's kind of unusual, which is what's called demand curtailment. So the challenge with electricity generation is that the demand for electricity changes throughout the day. I think about when we're awake and doing work, we need a lot of electricity. In the evening, we go to bed, we need less electricity. We call this the load curve. The load curve describes how much power we need. So this diagram on the right is a load curve in the PJM area and the Northeast, and over a period of days. And you can see that each day the load increases and decreases over, throughout the day over a period of a week here. The blue load is the original load, and the green load is what happens when you add data centers to the mix, new data centers. The problem is not the average amount of power demand. The problem is what's called the peaks. When it's particularly cold, people need electricity, or especially hot, people need more electricity, and demand peaks. You need enough generation to meet the peak load. Well, one way of addressing that is to turn off your data centers when load is peaking. And so we call that curtailment, demand curtailment. And what this chart shows is a peak somewhere between January 17th and January 18th, where there was peak demand for power. And by simply turning off the data center operations for a very limited period of time, maybe a matter of minutes or an hour or two, um, you shave the top of that peak load. The interesting thing about AI training, where I said a lot of power is needed today, is that you can pause and resume it. It doesn't have to run nonstop for 6 months. They just need about 6 months to train a model. In fact, during that period, they can pause it. And so demand curtailment can meet this load. In fact, an interesting study from Duke University suggests that you could create about 76 gigawatts of load. In other words, about 76 new power plants worth of electricity just by bringing data centers, turning them off 0.25% of the time, so less than 1% of the time turn off. And there's pretty much no cost to this, though it's unknown how willing the AI companies are to do this, to go with demand curtailment. So we have a number of solutions here. How do you choose between them? How do investors, how do AI companies, hyperscalers choose among these different power solutions? Well, to understand, you need to understand what are the key factors when adding power generation? What do people look at? And the number one factor historically has been cost. Lowest cost generation wins. It wins because electricity is a commodity. Why would you pay more for electricity based on the source? You just want cheap electricity. That's what people want. Um, but for tech companies, they're willing to pay more. Cheapest doesn't necessarily win because they need what's called speed to power. Tech companies need more power quickly, and power is a small percentage of the total spend in AI. So they're building a $10 billion data center, and they need to spend an extra 5 or 10 million on a little extra power to get it faster. That's an easy decision. They'll spend more. So cost isn't the only factor here. They also want firm power. They want power by and large that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. As I mentioned, they can do a little demand curtailment, but mostly they want 24/7 firm power. They also want what's called distributed power. They want the power located relatively close to their data centers. Otherwise, they got to run transmission lines. This is very expensive to do. Again, it takes more time. So they want power that's next to their centers. And lastly, CO2 emissions. Every major tech company has pledged to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. And so they do care about CO2 and climate change. And so let's dig into these. We'll spend a few minutes doing that, and then we'll wrap up with a few conclusions here. Let's talk about cost. So what are the lowest cost solutions out there today? The investment bank Lazard puts out an annual cost analysis, what's called a levelized cost of energy, or LCOE. And what their analysis finds is that even solar with battery storage, or wind plus battery storage, are essentially the cheapest forms of power generation today. And the only competitive solution with them is combined cycle gas. Those are the only technologies that are cheap and competitive today: solar, wind, and gas. But that's not the only factor. Speed to power. What's the fastest solution to building a new power source? It's definitely not nuclear, incredibly slow, particularly in the US. Hydro isn't really a solution because there's just not much more hydro to tap, and it takes a very long time. Wind and gas, talking 5 to 7 years to build out new wind and gas. Solar is by far the fastest. You can build a solar plant in less than a year, though it takes a year or two to get permits. Next thing I want to think about is, of course, CO2 factors and climate change. The good news here is that 5 of these 7 technology solutions have zero greenhouse gas emissions. And the other two, natural gas combined cycle and natural gas fuel cells, do have emissions, are problematic from a climate perspective, but not as bad as coal, approximately half of the emissions of coal on those technologies. Okay, let me just sum up here. So we need more power. We've got 7 different ways of getting that power for data centers. And we've got a number of factors we need to think about in deciding which of these technologies is going to essentially win in this race. And we can sum all that in a chart. This is puts all the factors on one page here. So down the left here, we've got our sources of power: wind, solar with storage, nuclear SMR, that's the small nuclear, geothermal, this is enhanced geothermal, natural gas combined cycle, natural gas fuel cells, and demand curtailment. And what we see is on cost, everything's pretty cost competitive except nuclear and geothermal. We don't really know the cost today. And natural gas fuel cells are costly. When it comes to speed, solar is fast, and natural gas fuel cells are fast. When it comes to firmness, in other words, what can run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, this is wind and solar's big weak spot. You add storage to that, you get partially firm. You get 24-hour day period power, but not necessarily constant over long periods of time. The other solutions give you firm power. When it comes to co-location, nuclear would have a big advantage. Natural gas has some advantages. Solar is a little more challenging. And then, of course, when it comes to CO2, the renewable technologies are clean. Natural gas is not. There are some other factors as well. The current administration, the Trump administration, is extremely hostile to wind, although they recently lost a large court case around that, or at least there was a ruling against it. Solar, there's a large pipeline of projects, but there are some permitting challenges. Both nuclear and geothermal have very significant bipartisan support. So even if the administration changes 3 years from now, there's probably still going to be very good policy support around that. Natural gas combined cycle has these turbine delays, but does have administrative support today. Fuel cells are costly, but they're available. And the demand curtailment, which is in many ways a perfect solution, we don't know whether or not AI companies will agree to do demand curtailment, are willing to do that. So let me conclude with a couple of key points. I'm going to wrap up, and then plenty of time for some questions. This growth is going to require unprecedented growth in U.S. power generation. So being in the electricity business, the power business, up until about a year or two ago, honestly, it's a pretty boring sector. For anyone on this webinar who works in the industry, take no offense, but it's a sector that's grown very slowly in the US, less than 1% a year most years over the last several decades. It's just, because of energy efficiency and, relatively slow growing economy and population, we haven't needed a huge amount of power growth throughout the US. That's changed. That's changed in the last year or two, and at least for the next 5 years, if not the next decade or more, you're going to see dramatically rapid growth and power demand throughout the US, and therefore additions to power in the US generation. So what does that mean? Well, the first is there are many sources of new power generation exist. It's not one way to solve this problem. We've got at least 7 ways to do it, and they each have their advantages and their challenges. Likely winners, if you had to pick winners today, likely winners are solar plus storage. That's battery storage. Why? Because it's cheap and it's fast. And you can put, this can get built out, is being built out very, very quickly today. And the other likely winner is natural gas, particularly fuel cells today. are being added all over the country very rapidly to today's sites. And combined cycle. There are turbine delays, but as turbines become available, you'll see combined cycle natural gas plants being built, new ones. The wild card winners here, and I describe these as wild cards because at this point we don't know enough. The industry is not mature enough to determine whether or not these will be successful. Nuclear SMR um, is a tremendously appealing use of nuclear power. It fits very nicely with data centers in terms of the size of them. But we won't know for at least 5 years whether or not this can really commercialize quickly and at the price points that make sense. Same for enhanced geothermal. We're going to know about enhanced geothermal more quickly, probably in the next just couple of years. We'll have a better sense as to whether or not this can be a commercial solution. It looks very positive at this point, but still early days. And then demand curtailment looks tremendous opportunity there, but it's just an unknown. What's unlikely to win is wind, in the sense that in the US, there's just a lot of hostility to wind in the administration. There are a lot of NIMBYism around wind turbines. And so that's really, really slowed the industry here in the US, almost stopped it actually in many places. And nuclear, it's not nuclear SMR, large-scale nuclear plants, traditional nuclear plants are just way too slow to build. You're talking sort of 10-year timelines. The last nuclear plant to be built in the US took almost 20 years. That was the Vogtle plant down in Georgia. And then nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is minimum 10 years off, probably more. Too many challenges at this point to be a solution here for AI. And what are the implications for climate change? And these are difficult to predict. And, disappointed I can't be more accurate for you given that climate change is something I focus on. But here's what it looks like. The growth in natural gas powered fuel cells will have little negative impact. And the reason for that is those fuel cells can be repurposed using hydrogen. They don't have to use natural gas. And when they use hydrogen, they don't have any CO2 emissions. The challenge today, there's just not enough inexpensive hydrogen available. Or these are good units for backup power. Ultimately can be repurposed because they're expensive. They're expensive to buy and expensive to run. So over time, they probably won't be the primary source of power for these sites. Growth in combined cycle natural gas, however, will have a negative impact. So every time a new combined cycle natural gas plant is built, once it's built, it tends to run for many, many years, for decades, and emit CO2, and that does have a negative impact from a climate perspective. And then growth and all the other solutions, solar, battery storage, nuclear, enhanced geothermal, these all have a positive impact. By mean positive impact, they have zero emissions and they advance those industries. Those industries become even more competitive as more of them or these facilities are built out. So when people talk about AI and data centers, they tend to be extremely worried about the implications from a climate perspective. As I showed you in an earlier slide, the demand for power from these centers is going to go up dramatically. More power may lead to more greenhouse gas emissions, and that leads to climate change and more challenge for us to avoid catastrophic climate change. But the reality is more complex than that. The reality is that most of these solutions have zero emissions. The more demand for power drives more demand for those solutions. More demand for those solutions makes them more competitive. And that's a positive case. That being said, we will probably be using a lot more natural gas as well, and that does have negative implications here. So that's where we're likely to end up. But the next few years will tell us where we go. So that's what I wanted to present to you today. Happy to take any questions on this topic, and if you'd like me to flip back to any of these slides with respect to any of your questions, I'm happy to do so.
Thank you so much, Professor Usher. All right, let's get started with some questions. We have an anonymous question. Is there an ethical limit to how much energy AI should be allowed to consume, especially if it competes with essential human needs?
It's a great question. I love bringing up the topic of ethics with business school students because it makes them immediately a little uncomfortable in the classroom, and that's always a good learning experience. Look, there's no easy answer here. It's very clear that any demand growth that requires a reduction in power availability for essential services creates an ethical concern, right? I mean, extreme case, if you're using power for AI and therefore you don't have power available, say to run a hospital, that would be a pretty obvious ethical quandary. In fact, it wouldn't be a quandary at all. It would be simply flat out wrong. Um, the reality is there isn't really a problem with power availability in the US. We have a lot of ways of generating power and we are building more power. The ethical challenge here is really around cost of electricity. So many parts of the country, we do see power price, electricity bills, utility bills going up very fast. And this, by the way, is going to have a lot of implications for the elections in the next couple of years. You're going to see a lot of upset consumers in the next few years as they see the shock of rising electricity bills. And I think there are ethical implications of that. And those bills are going up mostly because of AI and demand center demand. So this is driving power prices up. Um, so that's where the ethical quandary comes in. It's really, is it is it acceptable for power prices to be going up due to the demands of essentially businesses that are using more power? I think that is an issue, and I think it's an issue that's going to manifest itself politically in the next couple of years.
Thank you. We have a question from Marco. Marco says, to what extent is the rate of grid build out a constraint to these data center power supply solutions? With a follow-up, how do you best see the US grid systems being reformed at a high level to alleviate these constraints?
Yes, Margarita, you've identified a key problem in the U.S. is the grid. The grid is antiquated, and that's just you know, a generalization, but it's basically correct. The grid was designed a long time ago, a century ago, and it was really designed for what we call centralized distribution. So very large power generation that then is pushed out to consumers, primarily households and some businesses. Today, we don't have so much centralized generation. We have distributed generation. There's power generation all over the place, including on people's rooftops. And power demand needs have changed a great deal too. So the grid is under tremendous strain. The problem with updating the grid and making it more fit for purpose in today's world, part of that's, you know, technology and hurdles and financing and all the sort of things you would think about. But a big part of it is just building out transmission. The process for getting permits and right of ways to build permission is extraordinarily high in the US. It's close to impossible to build new power lines in much of this country. So what does that mean? Well, two things. One is that's a key reason why data centers they want to put their power on site or right next to the data center. They don't want to have to go through the process of adding transmission lines because it's so hard to do and it just takes too long. And so they want the power next to them. And so that's why siting where can you put power is incredibly important to data centers. And the other part of this, and this is a little complex and subtle, but you may notice in some of the slides I showed you, there's tremendous growth in batteries. Here, I'll flick back just 1 second. You see really rapid growth in batteries going on, right? Batteries are becoming the largest growth sector in the power industry today. And you may wonder, well, that's, obviously to work with solar and wind so you can sort of smooth out demand and make an intermittent power source available 24 hours a day. But the other use of batteries is to improve the grid. So you sort of think about the grid as all these wires pushing electricity all over the place. But in places where there's congestion, there's not enough wires, not enough transmission. You can partially solve that problem using batteries. Batteries allow you to sort of manage the grid much more effectively, much more efficiently. So you see a lot of batteries, battery storage helping us uh, deal with the complexity of an old and not very well designed grid for the modern era. It's a great question. Thank you.
We have a question from Dan Epstein. Um, to the point of power and off-grid, how important and how possible will it be to apply any of these types of power off-grid? And how will off-grid versus grid impact climate differently?
Hmm. So there's been an assumption, uh, a year or two ago when the demand for AI was becoming apparent that a lot of this power might be done off grid, that data centers would, you know, create their own source of power and sort of, be an off grid solution to this. But it's becoming increasingly clear that the data centers don't want to be off grid. And they don't want to be off grid for a simple reason, which is the grid provides resilience and backup and the grid's a fantastic solution to a lot of problems. In other words, I just said a few minutes ago, the problem is the grid is not up to task at the moment. It's aging and we're having trouble expanding it. In spite of that, the grid still provides tremendous value. And the reason for that is if you have off-grid power solutions and you run into any problem, your technology, doesn't stop operating for whatever reason, because even the most firm source of technology, nuclear or natural gas, nuclear just runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But even it goes down now, then you have to do maintenance and some repairs and things like this. The grid takes care of that problem for you, right? And so most of these solutions will not be used off grid um, if the data center companies can avoid it. That being said, some of them are really good for off-grid use. Fuel cells are perfect for putting them anywhere. Geothermal, as we see enhanced geothermal being built out, you might see some interesting off-grid applications there. Nuclear SMR, the small scale nuclear, has some really neat applications off-grid, for example, in the Arctic or a place like that where there's really no transmission. And of course, solar and wind have, especially solar's always been used off grid. I mean, drive down the highway and you'll see little, little things on the side of the road where there's, no transmission line that's powered by solar. So that's solar plus batteries. That's been off grid for a long time.
Alrighty. We have another question here. Uh, we're going to shift slightly. From Jesse Zhu, can you comment on the role of capital markets in supporting the build out of this expected demand? What types of firms are taking the lead in financing these projects? Hyperscalers, infrastructure funds, project finance lenders, etc.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say, Jesse, is there's no shortage of finance here in the U.S. We do have there's financing challenges in developing countries. That's a whole different discussion. But certainly in the US, and I'd say pretty much the same in Europe and China and to a certain extent India, financing is not the bottleneck. Who's providing the financing? Here in the US, there's a a large number of folks financing. Some of the hyperscalers are doing the direct financing, very strong balance sheets and access to capital, the Googles and Metas of the world. Um, Many very large infrastructure funds, the Brookfields and Copenhagen Investment Partners. They have enormous infrastructure funds that are doing this, and project finance lenders are doing it as well. That's essentially banks, special units of banks that project finance allows them to make very low cost loans uh, for the source of power. That's a traditional way of financing power, by the way, is through project finance. So it's there's a lot of players in this space. To the extent there's tax benefits as well, tax credits, which still exist for many of these technologies. You get tax credit specialists in the well in this as well. So you have a lot of different sources of financing. The cost of financing has gone up, uh, but that's because cost of financing has gone up for you know everything in the last few years as interest rates went up. Um, there's no shortage of capital. That's really not a challenge here. The biggest challenge, by the way, just to be absolutely clear, the biggest challenge in the US certainly is the time it takes to get the permits and the other regulatory processes to build in the US. It takes many years to put together the permits for these projects. And that's really the hardest part of the US. It's very hard to build infrastructure today. And that's the primary challenge.
Our next question is from Henry Garrido. He says, can you put in context the magnitude of energy needed? How much energy the US will need in, say, 2040 compared to today? And how about 2050? And maybe even the world?
Okay, Henry, it's a good question, and I don't have an answer for you off the top of my head. I should. I really should know those numbers. But I can put it in context for you. It's not, this is not as if we're going to, require 10 times the amount of energy we need to do in America or even the world. It's not of that magnitude. And so it's funny because when you think about things like AI growth, things are growing at 10 times, 100 times, things are growing extremely fast. But the energy need is not growing that fast. Here's the reason why though this is so important, which is if you take the energy need, which in this case is power, that means electricity, not fossil fuels for, oil for transport, but the electricity network in the US, the grid and all the generation that we have here throughout the country, it's a very, very large established base, roughly 1,000 gigawatts of generation. Think of that very, very roughly 1,000 large natural gas plants, just plus or minus. The issue is the incremental growth is changing dramatically. So as I mentioned earlier, this huge installed base that we have was only growing a little bit each year, and we had the capacity to grow it a little bit each year. Uh, that growth is going up dramatically, and that's the difference. So the overall numbers are not changing that fast, but the amount of growth is changing very rapidly, and that's what's causing the challenge here. But I don't have the exact numbers you're looking for. Apologies for that.
Our next question is from Marco Tarico. In Nov, I guess maybe that means November, Meta stepped into the world of energy trading. Do you foresee AI companies taking a more active voice in our power systems?
Yeah, I think there's some debate around that. I was just discussing that with one of my colleagues here, a postdoc student doing some work in this area. His take on it is that the AI companies, they don't want to be in the power business. It's not their area of focus or expertise. They don't look at power as something, business that they want to be in. It's just something they need to have. And so they're stepping into this area because they have to have power. There's no AI without electricity. And they're doing everything they can to secure it. And so you're seeing a more active role from them because they can't afford the risk that they don't have the power they need. But I don't think they're stepping into this because they see it as, a great business opportunity or a business they really want to be in. It's simply an area they have to make sure they can secure. Um, and so I think you will see more involvement for that reason.
Thank you. We have a question from Shin Wan. What is the most common mistake investors make when they try to pick winners in the power solutions for AI, underestimating permitting or mispricing reliability?
Interesting question. Um, I think the reliability issue is a relatively small one, actually. And the reason for that, there are several reasons for that. First of all, you have to understand that power reliability is an important factor, but power demand is an important factor too. In other words, electricity is one of those commodities that it has to be available when you want it, but you don't always want it. And so matching that supply and demand is something that's always been a challenge over the last 100 years. And system operators that manage power on the grid have gotten really good at it. Now that world's gotten a lot more complex as we've moved to distributed generation, intermittent generation like solar and wind and the like. Um, but again, they're very, very good at doing it. A good example of this, and if you're very interested in looking at this more closely, is to look at Texas in particular. The Texas grid, the operating system there is unique in the sense it's just one state. It's a very large state. It has a huge amount of renewable energy. Texas, by the way, number one in solar power generation and wind power generation today, significantly more than California, which surprised some people. They also, of course, have a lot of natural gas generation, they have a lot of batteries on the grid now, and so on. And look at how that they managed to keep everything balanced down there. It's really it's a really good example. You can have many days with 50% renewable energy, intermittent sources, and that's not really, it's very well balanced. Permitting, whole different issue. This is a massive risk for investors, because you need to make some investment to start a project before you can go through the permitting process. And just the cost of permitting. When I say permitting, I also mean things like interconnect agreements. So if you're going to generate electricity and you want to connect to the grid, you need an interconnect agreement with utility or whoever controls the grid in that zone. And those agreements require, in many cases, very large deposits of capital to secure those agreements and the like. But permitting is can be very challenging because, well, frankly, because of what we call NIMBYism, because there's a lot of people who don't want power projects or transmission lines near them, for sometimes very valid reasons, in many cases just because they just don't like the way it looks, um, or sounds. And they can block project. It's not that hard to block a project in this country. You simply hire a good lawyer. Now you may ultimately lose, but it could delay the project a number of years. So permitting risk is huge, and most power projects do not get built. They get blocked somewhere along the way, and that's a big challenge. We have what time for a few more questions? Lisa, what do
Yeah,
you say?
yeah. I think one or two.
Okay.
Okay. We have a question from Susan. Given geopolitical factors globally, such as the impact of the war in Ukraine on energy prices, energy access, and development of alternative energy, how will other countries fare in developing AI data centers? What do you see as the main constraints, including policy and power dynamics between the major powers?
Yeah, this is a hot topic right now, Susan. And really what it's coming down to is the race between the US and China around AI. And one of the key factors in that race, as we've discussed today's presentation, is the need for power. Where's that power going to come from? Is it available? And also ultimately what's going to cost? Because while the tech companies today are willing to pay almost any price to secure power, over time, low cost power becomes a competitive advantage for a company and ultimately for a country that has it in the AI race. And so, as a result of that, you have sort of a lot of sub races. Let's put them races within the race. The big race is AI, and which companies and which countries are going to have the most successful AI models and and commercial solutions. Below that race is a race for power because you need power to create AI. And within the power race, there's a bunch of technology races. So we have a race to build nuclear SMR. Several countries are building out their solutions, including China and the US. Geothermal, although that's primarily a US based technology at this point, but it is being developed in other countries. Some technologies around natural gas. And perhaps the most interesting race, but the one that may never be won, is around nuclear fusion. Because while I said fusion's not going to solve this problem because it's more than 10 years out, and that's absolutely the case. If a company or country is successful in developing fusion, it will give it a tremendous advantage in AI. It'll give it a geopolitical security advantage as well. And so that's one reason why both the US government and the Chinese government have been supporting with subsidies and other forms of support the development of fusion. Not necessarily because we need more power. There's a lot of ways to generate electricity. What do you need fusion for? Because if the government is successful, if one country is successful and the other is not, it will become a geopolitical advantage.
All right, we will take one last question here, and this question is from Yi Chen Sun. Are there concerns around potential power generation overbuild should there be a burst of AI bubble? And considering utilities are all excited about the growth opportunities and having early conversations with hyperscalers without firm commitments.
Yeah, I would say, Chen, there's the growth, the high, is there an AI bubble? I'd start there, right? A lot of talk about that. Of course, nobody knows at this point. There may be. Um, I think it's pretty clear that this technology is going to have widespread application. I don't think anybody's doubting that. What we don't know is whether the growth of this technology will be at the speed and the scale that some of the companies are pushing today and the financing behind that. But there's another issue around this issue of bubble that directly goes to the heart of your question of power demand. What's very hard to factor into these projections, you can make a projection about growth in AI. You can even make a projection around growth in data centers. And let's assume you're right. Those are already, bit very uncertain. What's hard to predict is energy efficiency. Because what tends to happen, well, it tends to happen, always happens, is that the models become more efficient. An example of this, the industry was a little bit shaken when Chinese launched DeepSeek, which is an LLM in China, because it's a much more efficient model than the models in the US today, which means it needs less power. So if the models go like DeepSeek does, you don't need as much power. You can do just as many, generation of AI with less power. And then the other thing that's hard to model is the chips themselves. So NVIDIA's chips and other chips, but NVIDIA is the leader in AI chips. Uh, each iteration gets more power efficient. Now, each iteration has far more ability to far more calculation. So overall, maybe requires more power. But the amount of power required per calculation goes down significantly every chip. And so you gotta include those efficiency factors into your forecasts. In other words, a long way of saying AI might continue to grow like crazy in the years ahead, but the actual power demand may not grow nearly as fast. Nobody knows. It's almost starting to grow, but how fast, we don't know.
Thank you so much, Professor Usher. That was extremely informative, and so many great questions came in. Thank you to everyone. I know we weren't able to cover all of them, but thank you so much. Thanks all for joining and again taking time to be with us. The CBS Faculty Live series will return in 2026. We're going to take a little holiday hiatus. So please look out for the next virtual talk with CBS thought leaders in the new year. All right, take good care, all. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.